Thanks for coming tonight. We're pretty excited about this topic, and hopefully you are too. One of the interesting things that we're seeing a lot of companies talk about at the moment is about innovation. It kind of is a natural thing to do with technology and innovation. What are companies doing? And we're going to explore some of the things and the organizational structure, the tooling, the lessons learned that we see a lot of successful organizations do around fostering innovation, how companies can tap into that, as well as exploring some of the things, the pitfalls that prevent innovation from actually happening.
But first, we're going to introduce ourselves on the basis that you probably don't know who we are. So first off, my name's James Lewis. That's what I look like. I'm not actually Alexi Sale. I'm actually James Lewis. I'm a technology principal with Thoughtworks, I guess senior engineer, something along those lines. We've got this up because I'm also a member of the Thoughtworks Technical Advisory Board, which I guess you can kind of think of as playing a similar role to the office of CTO in other organizations. And one of our functions is to produce the technology radar, which comes out about once every 6 months, and we look at up-and-coming technologies and trends in technologies. I'm not sure if people in the room are aware of the technology radar. There should be one out in about 2 months. If not, you can have a look at the old version that's on our site. So I guess that's me. This is what the technology radar looks like. What we have is effectively techniques, tools, platforms, and languages, and we describe, as I say, up-and-coming platforms, languages, tools, and techniques, and talk about their benefits to the industry, whether we think they've got any benefit at all, whether we think you should put them on hold, as in not use them in your organization, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll move on from that.
Great. And I'm Patrick Hua, and I'm author of the Retrospective Handbook. I'm a sort of tech lead for Thoughtworks, so I generally work with development teams, but I'm really interested in the sort of the human side to organizations as well. So things such as the organizational structure, the processes, all the way through to actually delivering software. And I still get to write code, so that's pretty exciting. On to Act 1.
So initially, we were wondering what we were going to do, talking about how companies innovate. And it seems to me that I'd imagine a lot of people in this room work for probably quite large organizations. We certainly do. We're up to about 2,000 now. And there are a lot of factors initially that make people think that they can't look to innovate. A lot of factors that seem to drag people and organizations back, make them maybe a bit fearful of what to do. I think everyone probably agrees that innovation at the moment is a hot topic, as Pat mentioned. Not only that, it's becoming something that's kind of crucial to organizations' success. If you think about some of the kind of big failures in the UK recently, some very large companies that have been going, that have had to shut their doors. I'm thinking about the kind of Jessops, I'm thinking about the HMVs. These are big organizations that over the last sort of decade, over the last 15 years, haven't been able to keep a pace with what's happening in the wider world, what's happening in the technology space, and with the rate of change that we're seeing in general. So I think what we thought we'd do first is talk a bit about some of the factors that inhibit innovation and what they are. What we see in big organizations and small organizations, these factors that might stop you from changing, from innovating, from getting new products out, from keeping your people happy, in fact. And the first one we want to talk about, actually, is this. This is my favorite animation of the entire deck. I hope you appreciate it. It's pop. It's permission. We see a lot in organizations, especially, but not always, large organizations, that people don't actually have permission, aren't able to innovate, aren't able to actually spend time on work that isn't directly related to their day-to-day job. Now, this is something that's fairly common across most industries, and is related to a number of different factors. We're going to talk about a couple of those now. The first one being this.
And one of the interesting things about organizations is that we're all kind of measured by stuff, right? So how many people have sort of goals that they have to set each year or on a very periodic basis? One of the interesting things that we find drives a lot of behavior is kind of how you get measured. And this is a really interesting question about, if you think about innovation in your organization, how does your organization measure this stuff? What is it that organizations value? And there's a sort of temptation in particularly in the sort of management layers to say, actually, everything that is important is worth measuring. And it's relatively easy to kind of measure some things. And there's some of the elements that we tend to see in organizations are things like utilization, money saved, story points delivered. These are kind of the very easy quantitative elements. And if you're in sort of consulting work, utilization might be one of those things, but even not, it's kind of like how many hours are spent working on effort. These are things that are very easy to measure. These are the things that are very visible. And you kind of have to think, well, how does that actually relate to innovation? What sort of behaviors does that kind of drive? Because these things are very easy to measure, one of the things is that it's very easy to incentivize things on this. So it's easy to set bonus targets. So we want you to improve, money saved or money earned. We want you to go faster at delivery. We want you to hit dates much faster. And one of the consequences of this is that actually innovation is kind of difficult to measure. And if you kind of compare those subjective things about what is successful innovation versus those easy to measure things that are numeric, the targets that kind of get set, you have to think, well, actually incentivizing for this is really, really hard. And so one of the things that you want to think about is you have to be careful about what organizational things get set, because there's certain ways that drives out behavior in the organization.
Obviously, you have to attribute everything. This is the only attribution I could find for this photograph, which says, reportedly a sign hanging in Albert Einstein's office at Princeton. So who knows whether that's true or not, but it's a nice quote anyway. So coming on from what Pat says, this idea that things that are easy to measure are easy to incentivize, it comes down to basic economic theory. There's something in economics called agent theory, right? We have Agent Smith and Agent Smith here. And agent theory is very, very simple. What agent theory says is effectively this. I'm going to enter into a contract with you, and I'm going to pay you to perform an activity, and then you perform it and you get the cash. It's a very, very simple transaction, but that effectively drives most of the behaviors that we see based on measurement and incentives in organizations. It's based on this kind of economic theory of agent theory. You perform an activity, I pay you. What does that mean? Well, the interesting thing is, if you've got a day job, and say I'm a software engineer, so I'm every day I'm supposed to be writing code, delivering my product to at a particular rate to make the company money. That's fantastic. But at the same time, I'm asked to do something special, to innovate on the side. This is a different type of work I'm being asked to do, right? And that's kind of interesting, because if you've got these two different types of work, one which is your kind of standard business as usual work, and then innovation on the side, or creating new products, having innovative ideas. That's actually very difficult to balance which one I'm actually going to do at any one point in time. And that's kind of logical, I think. And it's for very simple reasons. If you've got, say, performance-related work you're doing, your business as usual work that's going to contribute to the standard operating policy of your company, versus innovation, one of them you can measure very strongly, which is performance generally. You can measure how much work someone's done, have they filled their timesheets in, are they 100% utilised, are they going to hit their dates, and so on. And you can incentivise accordingly. These are called strong incentives. So you can do performance-related pay, you can put bonuses in place, all these different things. But on the other hand, if you've got something like innovation or innovative work and new product development, that's actually very, very difficult. That's very, very difficult to measure. How do you measure the money a company might make from a failed idea, say, compared to one that was successful? And you might have many, many failed ideas if you're innovating, if you're trying to create new products. It's very, very difficult to actually measure that. And therefore, it's very, very difficult to incentivize people to do that work, because any sane individual, faced with a choice between two different types of work, one of which you're measured against and one of which your pay is going to be dependent on, is going to optimize to do that one particular type of work. On the other hand, innovation, which might be the lifeblood of your company, which might lead to the long-term success of your organization, that's actually very, very difficult to get people to do based on any kind of measurements. So yeah, which activity are you going to perform? If your pay is related to the business as usual work you're doing, you've got absolutely no incentive to actually to innovate at all. You can just keep your head down and keep going. And this is one of the things that you tend to see lots in organizations, or we see a lot in organizations. There was one example I was at a bricks and mortar retailer that shall remain nameless, and they had a software development team, and they had their timesheet system in place. And it was interesting because chatting with the project management office there, the PMO, they were, oh, we haven't got any spare capacity. All of our developers are 100% utilised. Our timesheets say 100% utilisation the entire time. You actually look at the developers, and you talk to the developers, and the developers say things like, well, we're sitting on our behinds most of the time. We're not actually doing any work, because there's problems upstream with requirements coming to us and all these kinds of things. But the timesheets, of course they're going to fill the timesheets in to say 100% utilised, right? Because they're measured on utilisation, even though in that other time they could be doing much more interesting stuff.
So we've talked a little bit about sort of the measurements and incentivizations. One of the other things that we find affects the rate of innovation and the value that you derive from innovation is kind of the existing environment in which you work. And it's really interesting to take a step back from your day-to-day job, look at the organization, and see what things sort of support the ideas and how they get implemented. There's something about, in an ideal world, about thinking about you have this wonderful idea and you really just want to get it done. And what we find talking to particularly business people is that, somebody who has a really new idea, we want to get some sort of software out there. And in their heads, it's a very simple process, is that I have this idea, it'll go through a very sequential set of stages, and it'll kind of go out. Even getting another one out and thinking about it, things just kind of, smoothly flow. How many people believe this is true? Not one hand. Exactly. And one interesting thing in reality is what kind of happens is this sort of toing and froing. So perhaps there's something about late discovery of things not quite working, and maybe there's something about the product, and actually based on usage through our tests, we've found out actually, we want to change some ideas. And maybe there's something about, actually like what we started off with has kind of shifted as we're developing it, and the market has changed. So we want to actually get stuff out there. And so what's really interesting is that there's this idea of we have this thing that we want to try, getting stuff out there, and how fast we can deliver that is a big constraining factor of innovation. And this idea, if you haven't heard of it, is called concept to cache. And if you can kind of like work out how fast this is in your organization, the faster it is, the faster you'll be able to innovate. And this is a really big thing for sort of optimizing sort of delivery cycles and being able to get ideas into implementation out. The longer that is, the longer that your idea is going to go stale. The longer the idea is going to go unvalidated, and you might end up investing a lot more resource than what you thought, and your returns are definitely affected by that.
So I was at an organisation, we were looking at requirements that had been gathered, and they had this kind of 5,000-page functional specification. It had been in development, just the functional specification, for sort of 18 months. It was a fairly complex system, but not an overly complex system, particularly complex problem to solve. 18 months of analysis later, and they come to the point they're actually going to start implementing it. Now, if you spent 18 months in today's world actually analysing requirements, right, the world is going to have moved on. The world is going to have moved on in that time. After 18 months, you might as well, the assumptions you made at the start of that, about your market, about your competitors, it might as well be science fiction, effectively, or fantasy. So this is a diagram of a real organisation's IT systems. I imagine this probably rings some bells with some people in the room. We've got things like finance systems, middleware databases. I love that name. It's actually a system called the middleware database. We've got a data warehouse. We've got a bunch of other stuff hanging around. Most organisations, unless you're lucky enough to be working in a startup, that you don't start from scratch. Right? You're constrained by the landscape in which you're already operating. You're constrained by the systems you have, the tools you have in place, the processes, the routines, the technologies, and all governance, all these different things. All right? You don't start with a clean slate. And actually, most people in this room, who works in an organisation, hands up, of over 1,000 people in this room? Quite a few. Okay, keep your hands up. Over 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, I'm going logarithmic now, 10,000. Okay, 100,000? Okay, so somewhere between over 10,000. Well, people who work in organisations bigger than 10,000, right, your systems don't look like that, right? They look a bit more like that, probably. It's probably a little bit more complex. Now, trying to understand actually how you can take ideas and plumb these new product ideas, for example, into existing systems is really, really, really difficult, especially when you're potentially, I was going to say encumbered, but that's probably not the right word, when you're governed by a large number of models. I'm thinking kind of IT governance, things like ITIL and things like that. It's not easy to actually make change at a fast rate in systems, in enterprise architectures that look like this.
And I think one thing that's really interesting when systems get as complex as this is that your organization starts to optimize for the size of this. So you need a little bit more specialist skills to maintain things like environments. So you end up with an operations department that are managing environments. You end up with managers who have to coordinate across the different groups. And that starts to add sort of overhead to getting ideas out there. And so one of the things that we look for when we're looking at organizations that are considered innovative is thinking about how long does it take to go from nothing to production infrastructure. So that idea to implementation. And you've got to think about how organizations have handoffs within them to see how you can optimize for that.
I had a question at that point, actually. I'm going to go back to the room again. How long do you think, in an ideal case, using today's technology landscape, we can go from nothing, no source code at all, to production-ready, production-ready, public-facing website, for example? Any answers to that? Best case? 6 weeks. Any advance on 6 weeks?
3 weeks. 3 weeks? 1 week?
3 weeks.
Any others?
So it's order weeks. Cool. We might come back to that. So we've looked a little bit about some of the constraints. I mean, we've touched on them very, very briefly. I'm sure people in the room kind of recognize a lot of these things from their own organizations. So what have we looked at? We're looking at the difficulties of incentivizing people to actually work on types of work that could be classed as innovative or new product ideas, for example. We've talked a little bit about measurements. We've talked a little bit about sort of the system landscape, the kind of big organizations that you kind of that people working and the constraints that you have to operate under. I think we'd like to talk a bit now about something a bit more positive, because it is possible, even in very, very large organizations, down to very, very small organizations, to actually to be very creative, to be very innovative, to push the boundaries, to come up with new product ideas, and so forth. And we're going to draw a bit in this next section towards the latter part of this talk on some ideas contained in a book by a guy called John Roberts. So he wrote this book called The Modern Firm back in, I think it was 2004, or at least it won the Economist's Best Book of the Year prize in 2004. And in this book, it's a fantastic book. I heartily recommend it. He talks a lot about organizational design, organizational structure, what makes successful organizations. And he goes back, I think, probably to the mid-19th century, looking at different types of organization, how they've structured themselves in order to succeed. And in this book, he compares and contrasts two different styles of organizational design, effectively. So on the one hand, you've got the kind of very hierarchical type of organization. He talks about, if you think about many large finance organizations, in my experience, would probably count as a sort of very hierarchical organization, not limited to finance. Many other organizations are too, compared to very flat styles of organizational design. People have probably heard about Toyota and how Toyota work. They're kind of an example of that, very flat organizational design. And he tries to characterize these types of organization using a set of fairly objective sort of standards, which he calls, the acronym is PARC. This is people, architecture, routines, and culture. So your organization, effectively, and the design of your organization is made up of these 4 different factors. So architecture not being the bricks and mortar architecture, this is the organizational architecture of the organization. The structure, who manages who, where managers report, etc. He also talks about routines. So these are the sort of both formal routines, the processes that you follow, and also the informal routines in organizations as well. Finally, he talks about culture, and we'll come back to that in a bit, because this is probably the most important part of of most organizations when it comes to actually innovating, in my opinion. So I want to take a brief tour through some companies that you may or may not have heard of. So Valve, who's heard of Valve? So most people in the room, we've got some crib notes on this, or some notes on this. So Valve are a pretty successful software house. They're a games house. They build computer games. And they've been around quite a long time now, 20 odd years, I think. I think back in 2011, they were about 250 people. It's probably a bit more than that now, 500, say. And their market valuation, privately held, but in theory, their market valuation is about $1.5 to $2 billion US dollars. So pretty big, pretty successful organization. They produced a whole bunch of computer games. So 1998, Half-Life, Counter-Strike, Steam, which is they're about to release a new games console, all very exciting, and Portal, which is another computer game. The interesting thing about these guys is they operate at the extreme end of the flat organizational structure scale. They're wildly successful. Some years they're growing 500% annually. Wildly successful, wildly innovative, and they have no constraints on what you can do when you get in. And that sounds kind of crazy, right? But this is actually true. This was leaked on the internet. This is Valve's handbook for new employees. The title here is, for those at the back, A Fearless Adventure in Knowing What to Do When No One's There Telling You What to Do. And in this book, they've got an org chart, and it's one guy, who's the guy who started the company, and then 500 people in a line. And that's pretty much it. Now, I work for a professional services organization. I'm used to spending, I'm used to being, to the functions of resource management, as I'm sure most software houses are. You have a function whose job it is to start project teams in order to be assigned to a particular piece of work, which you then deliver, then you disband after the kind of project team. Valve don't do any of that. They don't have this resource management function. They have lots of different projects, lots of different products out there, and they're very innovative. They don't have any of that. Instead, what they have is the idea that you choose what you want to work on. That's it. And ideas live or die by how successful you are in promoting those ideas within the organization. So literally, there's no management. No one has a manager. No one tells anyone what to do. And there's a bunch of other stuff as well. One of the things that's very interesting is they have a culture of completely no blame. So mistakes are not penalized ever. And that's kind of another example, another example of that would be, say, Nokia. I'm not going to talk about Nokia now. I'm not sure if there's anyone from Nokia in the room. But Nokia in its heyday, sort of 20-odd years ago, they had exactly the same kind of idea with their culture. There was no separation between CEO, management, chairman, and their staff. Yeah, they had some more levels of hierarchy than Valve do, but they'd all eat in the same canteen. And even when I think their share price halved in value at one point because of a logistics failure. Like literally billions wiped off the company. No one was fired for it. And this is a really interesting theme, that actually these organizations, as well as having things like flat hierarchies, kind of a lot of trust in their staff, hiring good people, they also don't penalize people for making mistakes.
Let's have a look at an example a little bit closer to home. Who knows about giffgaff? Who has a giffgaff? Okay, so it's quite interesting. It's owned by Telefonica, who runs O2. And it was started probably about 3-4 years ago, and it was started by a guy inside O2 who thought, he went to a conference and he came back and said, we need to apply this Web2O thinking to the telephone industry. It's kind of something that isn't really well known for innovation. We know that actually a lot of them tend to take a long time to get stuff delivered. There's not really a lot of value for money, and we always kind of concern ourselves with thinking about how much our phones cost. Giffgaff is apparently this Scottish word. I'm not Scottish, but it's apparently a Scottish word for mutual giving. And so the whole idea of giffgaff was sort of taken from this idea of a Web2O community and this idea of crowdsourcing. And wondering if we could actually turn it into a sort of a company in this industry that's not well known for innovation. What's interesting in that sort of PARC acronym that James was talking about earlier is that they said rather than do it within the confines of O2, I want some money and invested in this organization, and we're going to set up a new organization. And that's kind of how giffgaff was actually created. And because the culture thing was really important, what they really wanted to do was actually involve their customers in the way that they actually innovate. So giffgaff at the moment actually involve their customers by paying them for their ideas. So they'll have different tasks, and people can actually offer their ideas about different things. So I think one of the examples is that they had this thing called giffgaff labs, where they would sort of have some ideas crowdsourced from different people, and then they would try it out. And they would offer some of these sort of lab products, and if they kind of took off with a sort of small closed beta test group, they would turn them into a product sort of company. I think what's really interesting as well is that they don't really hold back in terms of what contributions that their community can make. So if anyone has used the iPhone app by giffgaff, that was actually started by a community member who said, hey, I actually think we need an iPhone app, and they ended up employing that person to sort of turn it into a final product idea. So it's an interesting way of actually getting innovation from different people and really tapping into that. So giffgaff is this whole company structured around the culture of mutual giving and trying to tap into the innovation that actually within our own confines of it, as an organization, our own processes, we can't do it all ourselves. It's very interesting.
I was looking to change contract recently, and I was in Phones for You, and I was asking, what about giffgaff? I mentioned giffgaff. And the guy looked at me as if I was stupid and said, but you won't have any customer support with them. You have to go online for it. I thought, well, I've never had any customer support from any organisation ever that's been anything other than rubbish. So for me, I think that's where I'm going to go next, but there we are.
I think another interesting organisation sort of tapping into innovation is Nordstrom. Who's ever shopped at Nordstrom? We don't really have them here in the UK, but they're kind of a very high-end retail, bricks and mortar kind of shopping, kind of like a Harrods in a way. It's quite high class. They're very well known for their customer service. And one of the things that they're realizing is actually as a bricks and mortar kind of store, a retail store where people go to, they need to start getting into sort of the electronic experience. They need to look into their online sort of experience, and they need to actually work out how technology can supplement their experience and the customer service they provide in their stores. So they started this thing called the Nordstrom Innovation Lab. The goal of this lab is actually to work out ideas and to test ideas. So every week they're testing at least one idea, and it's from concept to cash. So they've actually done things like set up a lab inside one of their retail stores where they're actually testing ideas. They're paper prototyping with real customers. They're sort of hacking stuff together to actually test out ideas as to what makes sense in terms of things like an iPad app for maybe comparing sunglasses in their stores. And the whole goal for the Innovation Lab is really to tap into what things would make sense for them to turn into a product. So at the end of a week, if a product hasn't been killed off already and they've worked out, actually, that's a really bad idea, they're going to actually turn it into a real product with the rest of their sort of organization and turn it into a sort of real experience. So it's an interesting model for how they're sort of fostering innovation. So we'd like to take a bit of a shift. We've kind of explored what are the things that constrain organizations, maybe some examples about how companies are kind of doing it themselves and why they're actually succeeding in what they're doing. We'd like to delve a little bit deeper into the actual, well, what is it that they're doing that's kind of special? What is it that you guys can take away and get innovation into your own organization? The first one is really about the sort of idea generation. And I think one of the interesting things is everyone always says, I'm not very innovative. I don't really have great ideas. What's really fascinating is that's actually a bit of a lie. Everyone's really creative. And one of the things that often prevents us from being creative is that we're not in that environment to think about and to talk about our ideas. So we're not really in this sort of safe zone where you can say, I think this is a bit of a crazy idea. How about we give it a go? And one of the examples that we kind of do, that we sort of run with clients is when we're thinking about new products and new ideas, some sort of brainstorming exercise. So here's a sort of a picture of our team at work where we've sort of split up a room. Some of the preconditions that you want for proper brainstorming, because brainstorming kind of, there's good ways and bad ways of doing it, is that you really want a big, diverse crowd of people. So you don't really want people of the same role doing the brainstorm. You kind of want a whole plethora of interesting, diverse groups. You want people at different levels in the organization, maybe some customers. And you really want to talk about what is it that you're trying to do. So the broad sort of theme of it. Are you building sort of a mobile app? Are you doing a digital product? What sort of thing are you trying to do? The really key thing to brainstorming effectively is doing it independently first. So this is what we call silent brainstorming. So it doesn't have to be for very long, but it's about 10 minutes of rapid idea recording. So give people some index cards, some sticky notes, some pens, and let people go crazy. So you can see people sort of scribbling stuff down. At the end of that period, so 10 minutes is pretty fast, you get, say, 20 people together, you can have, if everyone generates at least 4 ideas, you have 40 different ideas to kind of come across. Then you have a little bit of a session where you're asking people to present back their ideas around what's the concept behind the idea. And, at this point, you're really not trying to sort of criticize or sort of critique each of these ideas. What's interesting is there's normally some interesting gem in each of those ideas. You may end up killing that idea at the end of it, but what's really valuable is the fact that we're kind of cross-pollinating diverse features or concepts across lots of different sets of people. And this environment's a really great way of actually coming up with lots of interesting ideas to explore. So you can kind of see some outputs of things like nag a friend. And then the next thing is kind of thinking about, well, how do you actually work out where do you start? If you want to actually implement something, how do you actually work out which idea you pursue? And that's where you need to actually start to get somebody who is going to drive this program forward. And that's where committee and sort of decisions by committees just doesn't really cut it. You kind of, what we've found with a lot of companies is that if a company board is kind of making decisions as to which idea to pursue for an innovation, things die off pretty quickly. And what you really need is somebody who's pretty courageous, pretty bold, who can have the authority about making a choice, who's happy to take that risk. When you have so many different people sort of having opinions over whether or not an idea prospers, generally you'll get a very subdued kind of, pleases the crowd kind of idea. And actually it's not very innovative. So what you're actually searching for is a pretty strong sort of product owner who can actually drive an idea forward. And the key is not trying to invest too much in it, but actually trying to test these ideas out very quickly. So before, when we were talking about concept to cash, if you can actually test and validate these ideas, it can actually be a really quick way of actually validating it and seeing if you want to invest more. And we'll get onto that in a little bit. Another idea that we see a lot of companies do are things like the hack day. Has anyone ever attended one? Quite a few. So it can be a pretty exciting, kind of interesting thing. One of the things that we find with technology is that actually your technologists, so the people writing code, tend to be the most connected with what else is going on in the industry. And they're normally the people who are also at the coalface, sort of like getting new features done. And one of the interesting things about the hack day is by giving people some freedom, some space, you can actually give some people a way of applying their own ideas about, I've always had this thing that's nagged me that I think our customers could get a lot out of. So all it really takes is maybe a day, maybe it's a weekend, where you sort of get people together to form sort of groups of implementing an idea. And the idea is that it's only a day, so there's not so much of an investment, but actually you let people sort of realize their concept very quickly. And then at the end of that day, all the sort of groups that you've sort of formed around each of the ideas kind of showcase to the business, this is the stuff that we've kind of played around with, what do you think? And I don't know how it's worked out for any of your companies, but we find that normally that if you have a pretty big group of like 5 to 10 groups, there's normally one idea there that actually the business do want to take forward. What's interesting is that the things that people go for are not the things that somebody is going to be prioritizing in the future roadmap. And often it's kind of stuff that has kind of made sense, but has never really had the time and attention from the business. And we kind of talked a little bit about innovation. So with hack days, that tends to be kind of a little bit more internal. There's probably about 40 different organizations in the world that have innovation labs. It takes a little bit more effort to set these up. There's the organizational structure. But if you're in any of your large companies, actually having a small group, quite detached, that isn't sort of impeded by the organizational structure, that has sort of full authority, that's a little bit of a sort of cross-representation of all the different roles, if they can actually optimize to get ideas out and test them, then actually that's a really easy way of actually working out ideas to reality and testing them. And I think the testing process is really important as well. So as part of any of these things, you can't really just say it's a good idea and continue going on. One of the key distinguishing features about all of these things is that we're sort of really testing the product with real end users. Normally when we talk to companies about innovation, they say, well, that's really hard to do. Like we want to get the right sample group and our delivery pipeline takes 3 months to get anything out there. How do we actually test anything? Well, what's interesting is that it doesn't take much to actually build a pretty usable prototype. And the next slide, we're going to have a bit of a video of us going down to, say, Paddington Station, where you get access to sort of ordinary people who can actually get some fast feedback on an application. And so we built a prototype in about 2 days, put it onto a phone for people to be able to test, and you can see some of the comments about sort of the quick user testing from it.
Charity, okay? Because I'm quite familiar with just giving. So donations, yeah? This is all feedback, right? Feedback for completing some kind of charitable event or event for charity.
Yeah.
List of donations, people's comments. Day judge timeline.
I don't know if it's like me or the phone or what have you, but like what's being donated and like what's going on with like different charities and stuff like this. So you have a target yourself, or? Oh no, is it when you do sponsored stuff? Is it something like that?
Yeah. So I'm expecting like you're going to find out throughout each month of like what charities are going to give you or what people are doing within the charity.
Very easy to use app. I think it's good. It's like it's really clear and it's like it tells you what's going on, what people are saying, what people are like donating and everything.
Cards. Is there something to do with cards?
So what's really interesting about guerrilla user testing is that it doesn't take much time. So it took our team probably about 10 minutes to go down there, ask a few people who were happy to be recorded about playing with something. And you don't really tell them that much about the thing that you're building. What you're trying to do is really get some fresh feedback. So you have your organization and your team thinking about this idea, but sometimes you get wrapped up in those ideas that actually kind of turns out to be not such a great one. And so actually getting some real feedback from real users doesn't take a lot of effort. You don't have to set up an expensive lab, although that's also a great way of doing it if your sort of target market's hard to get. But often you can sort of go down to somebody who's representative of your product, and you can kind of get an idea as to what the feedback might be like.
So we talked a bit about generating ideas. We talked a bit about guerrilla user testing there. So this is the cycle of coming up with an idea, testing whether it's a valid idea. You actually need to be able to build it if it is. All right? And as we saw earlier in the presentation, the ideal delivery pipeline, the concept of cache thing, the concept of cache pipeline, probably doesn't look like you think it does in your head. It's much more about toing and froing. What we're really talking about is this is the build, measure, learn loop from the lean startup movement. What we're really talking about is how to get your ideas built into a product which you can then measure the success of with real customers using real data before plowing that back in. Now, the problem here is, as you can see over here, we've got this build piece. We're sort of talking, when we asked earlier about how long these sorts of things take. How long does it take to get something out into the market? How long does it take to get a new product out there? And we had sort of order week, order 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, etc. Actually, that's pretty good for most organizations, if you're talking order weeks. I was talking of the telecoms organization. I was at a big telecoms provider in the UK. It took us 9 months to get a virtualized environment just for development. So we had to develop on laptops, but it was a quirk of accountancy that laptops cost 1 pence to the project. So we ended up with 20 laptops as our build farm. But it took 9 months to actually get anything like a production-ready environment. And that was a virtual environment. That was an environment that could be spun up on virtual machines. And that's not that uncommon for very big organizations. A lot of organizations are getting better at doing this kind of thing. But really, often, we're talking about months in this build part of this loop. What would it be like if we could actually bring it down to that kind of, that idea of weeks, order weeks? how much more stuff would you be able to produce? How much more stuff would you be able to get out there? How many more ideas would you be able to test? How much more would you be able to learn about your customers' wants and needs? Well, a lot more, a lot more. What about if it was days? What about if you were able to turn around ideas in single days? And I think there's probably some people in the room who I won't mention by name who are actually working in organisations that are a bit like that, if not shorter, if not in fact hours. And this is the idea of continuous work, continuous delivery of working features into production really comes into its own. If you're able to actually produce code, produce prototypes and deploy them into production-ready environments in hours so you can actually show people, you can test it, you can build it, you can flex, that's really powerful. So when we talked earlier, we sort of said about order weeks, how long it would take to get into a production kind of ready web-like environment. And I said we might come back to that. I don't think it takes weeks. I was going to do this live, but I didn't have enough goats to sacrifice. Everyone knows that you have to sacrifice lots of goats to the god of live demos. So what I did instead was I recorded a screencast of me producing an application and deploying it into a production environment on the web. It's noddy, it's hello world, but this is a real application deployed into a real web server with DNS all taken care of, for those of you who are more techy than others. And the infrastructure that it's deployed onto, literally, you've got a little scale where you can say, oh, I want another 10 servers for that to run on. I want another 100 servers for it to run on. Right? And I'm going to show you this now, see how long it takes. So I might talk you through it. It's a bit... I'm just going to create some directories and things to start with. I'm starting from scratch here, completely nothing. So create a new product directory, create a new product idea. So I'm using this tool called Line. It's from Clojure, it's a programming language. And that's just created me a skeleton project. Right? So all that's done. This is my project structure. It's got some interesting profile stuff that comes with the skeleton. This is my project file. It's Clojure, as I said. What else am I going to do? Oh, so obviously we're all good developers. So we all use version control. So I'm going to use Git for version control here. So I'm going to just initialize a version control repository. There you go. I need to add all my files into my version control repository now. Git add -a. They're all added. I need to commit that. Excellent. So I was deciding what shall I use for the production infrastructure. Oh, Heroku. Heroku is pretty standard these days. Runs on Amazon Web Services. So maybe we can use Heroku to do this. So I'm going to log into Heroku. This is a bit dull. jlewis@thoughtworks.com. I'm not showing the password. I'm not that daft. And after that, I need to associate my project I've got, which has come from scratch. This is my skeleton with the Heroku project, which I'll do in a moment. I'm just showing that at the moment, I haven't got any remote repositories for my version control system. Finally, I'm saying Heroku create. That's going to create me the Heroku project structure. Git push Heroku master. This will take some time. I'll talk through what it's doing in the background. Basically, what this is doing in the background is taking my local files that are checked into my local version control repository. Admittedly, it's just hello world skeleton at the moment. There's not that much in there. It's taking my local files. It's going to push them up to Heroku, which is a platform as a service provider based on Amazon Web Services. Heroku will allow you to push a number of different standard types of application. Ruby on Rails, say. In this case, it's a standard Clojure app. A whole bunch of others, Django, say. And then it's going to deploy it for me in a production-hardened environment. So if I can find my browser. Done. Hello from Heroku. And that's Hello World deployed into hardened production environment based on Amazon Web Services, which everyone in this room is obviously very well aware these days is PCI level 1 compliant, so no worries about that kind of stuff, about infrastructure and things. And that's how long it took to get a simple Hello World application into a production-ready environment, which is about, 1.4, 1.8 minutes or something. So 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 4 weeks. Actually, as we sort of heard earlier, how long was the prototyping? How long did that take for that project? 2 days. 2 days. So rather than having Hello World, this is actually with proper web pages that you can browse to on your mobile, you can take out and show people what this stuff looks like. A bit quicker than 6 weeks, though.
So we had one example of James talking about this, and what's really interesting is that was just one sort of platform, and these days we have quite a lot of choice in terms of lightweight tools, of coming up with things that we can actually test ideas pretty quickly. And we can turn those ideas, validate those ideas really quickly and turn them into real products once we get that user feedback and a little bit more real data in terms of what we actually want to do, if it meets our target market, if we want to add different features, before we actually commit to having a big project around things and getting it delivered and productized. And what's really interesting, I guess, is all the sort of different types of things that support that. So we have Bootstrap from Twitter, which creates really lovely web pages very quickly that you can actually build as a platform, some sort of website. You have different sort of cloud services for building products. So CloudBee being sort of a continuous integration environment that allows us to spin stuff up. GitHub in terms of where do you store stuff? So you need to share stuff maybe amongst a team, but you can't commission a server. It takes maybe 8 months to get a small laptop because it takes 1p. So GitHub might be a really good alternative of actually hosting stuff, and it's very cheap. In terms of actually lightweight frameworks that allow rapid prototyping, fast feedback, hopefully most people know about Ruby on Rails. That's been out there for probably at least a decade now. And Sinatra is a little bit more of a lightweight app if you're doing things like web services and REST services. And if you're into Python, then Django is a really good sort of framework for rapid prototyping of this stuff. And then, you have the creative kind of like website type stuff. Where do you deploy it on? Well, there's actually a whole bunch of choices out there as well. So Heroku works very well with all of these sort of tooling out here. But if you need something a little bit more grunty or something a little bit more PCI compliant, you have Amazon Web Services directly, as well as having the choice of things like having distribution around the world if things like latency are a really big key. I think the key thing to think about this around this area of tooling is that there's a lot of options out there. This doesn't even start to become part of it. And what's really interesting is giving people a choice of, if you really want to support innovation, allowing people to use some of this stuff to actually innovate and come up with some interesting sort of things. I know that a lot of organizations, particularly large organizations, have approved software lists. And of course, that's really important for things meeting compliance and getting into production. But if you're really testing out ideas really rapidly, you really want to open up the field to new things, new ideas that allow for fast feedback. If anyone has built like a Java web app, and I've done that quite a lot of times, deploying into a container takes almost as long as it took as James to build a new app and deploy it into the cloud. So it's really interesting because we can build with new tools that allow us faster feedback, that test out these ideas. And that testing part is a really essential part to innovation. Because the key to successful innovation is not having one idea and following it through, but actually testing out lots of different ideas and failing really fast and changing your idea based on real feedback. And these tools are some of the things that can help you do that.
So we talked a bit about testing, the sort of build and the build cycle. We're going to sort of step back a bit again and go back up into sort of organizations again now. Talk a bit about people, architecture, routines, and culture. Really what we're going to talk about is the impact of things like leadership in your organization and the impact of some of the other factors in the PARC acronym, people, architecture, routines, culture. So as an example of leadership being important, Amazon Web Services, people understand where Amazon Web Services come from or have heard this story. It's a fairly famous story these days. But Jeff Bezos was getting annoyed with the fact that he was having to spend millions upon millions of pounds every year upgrading their internal software systems, running, which were at one point on one big database. And at one point, the next software upgrade was going to be something along the lines of like 6 months profit for Amazon at that point. So he issued an edict from the top. We shall no longer be using this particular type of system. We're going to use a completely different type of system. We're going to do service-oriented architecture in that case. And from that kind of that stand by him, the kind of as the leader of the organization, everything else changed actually underneath. And actually, he's changed pretty much the world. Amazon has changed the world and how we deliver software these days. Amazon Web Services came from that decision where they moved towards making their infrastructure commodity and then such a commodity that they were able to sell it on to other people. Leadership is really important. Another example would be Thoughtworks, actually. So some while back, Thoughtworks the Thoughtworks leadership team came up with this idea of pillars. People in the room who aren't that familiar with Thoughtworks might not know about these pillars, but they sort of characterize and sort of describe the things that we feel are important as an organization. They came from our leadership team. They had the kind of vision that for Thoughtworks, the pillar 1, which is running a sustainable business, pillar 2, which is being champions of software excellence. I think there's probably some more to that one. I can never remember that. But that'll do, champion software excellence. And pillar 3, which is effectively making a positive social impact. Those 3 things, which came down from our leadership team, basically describe the entire way we work at the moment and all the choices we make when we work. And it's been amazing over the last 3 years, just that decision by our leadership team have actually caused a massive change in the culture of the organization, where now we actually talk on a day-to-day basis about what the impact of the work we're doing on these 3 pillars are. Is this stuff that we're doing, does that impact the world in a good way? But if we make that choice, that's going to maybe impact our ability to carry on doing business in the future, even though we'd love to do it, those kinds of things. And this stuff comes down from our leadership team. Well, it did in our case. Leadership is really important. There's also this strange idea of the impact of intangibles on organizations' market value.
So a lot of the time when you're thinking about sort of what leaders do is that it's kind of a supporting structure. It's the organizational rules, the things that kind of get set in place. And they're the things that the leaders have the most influence on. They're the things that they have the authority to change. So if you're sort of, and I've been in this situation where you're a developer and you want to sort of change the way that the organization's working, you really have to get buy-in from the leaders because they're the people who have the ability to change the environment that people work in. And what's really interesting is that there's this study that was published in the book that James had on the other slide, which talked about, well, where is it that leaders have the most influence on, and what are they spending their most time on? So, from like 1982 to 2000, you can see that actually the impact of intangibles has gone up quite a lot, up to 85%. Whereas things like the more tangible stuff, so the people, the sort of the assets, the sort of the things that you store in warehouses, actually the value of that is starting to decrease in proportion to the knowledge work, the innovation. And so thinking about what things that managers can do to influence sort of successes of company and innovation is really thinking about what are the things that sort of contribute to supporting things like R&D, that support the ability for people to come up with new ideas and actually test them out. The things that some companies are doing around patents and a lot of that's becoming a lot more of the worth that companies are having rather than the actual physical assets that are stored within their own company. So I think the next kind of question is, well, okay, we have ideas, we can implement them. How do we get funding? Because that's normally the next big problem that leaders have. And one of the things that we are trying to explore with a lot of companies is really looking at how successfully do people do this. And what doesn't really work very well is one big experiment, or what we like to say, one big bet. So if you spend £1 million on an idea and it fails, that's quite a lot of money to go down the drain. Whereas if you end up with a lot more sort of smaller spread bets, so we try 10 different things, maybe some of them don't work, we invest a little bit more, and as we're progressing, we can spend a little bit more each time, we can actually make sure that we spend our money a little bit wiser. Unfortunately, our budgeting cycles and our organizations aren't as accustomed to working this way as much as possible. But it is possible, and not all companies operate in this sort of yearly cycle that a lot of people do.
Sorry, Pat, just to interrupt there. And what's interesting here is we've got to say the representation of 4 ideas, 3 of which have been canned, right? Although one of them has made a big pot of gold. Now, this kind of relates back to this idea of making mistakes and being unafraid to make mistakes. In a lot of organizations I've worked, these things would actually cause you quite a lot of grief. The 3 things that failed, that was a failure. That you should have made that work. But actually, in these cases, it's quite often a success to can stuff as early as possible. Right? Not every idea is going to be a great idea, but you still have to fund enough of them to actually find the ones that are. So this is a quote from a book called Slack. Who's come across this? Slack. We've got a couple of people in the room. Only 2 people in the room, actually, which is interesting. By a guy called Tom DeMarco. The subtitle is Getting Past Burnout to Busy Work and the Myth of Total Efficiency. And that quote says, "The legacy of the 90s has been a dangerous corporate delusion. The idea that organizations are effective only to the extent that their workers are totally and eternally busy." This is timesheets again. This is 100% utilization. This is related back to the kind of measures and incentives idea again. This is a great book. I heartily recommend this for anyone in the room who is a manager, who would like to be a manager at some point, of people who has any passion for that kind of stuff. Because what we see an awful lot is that actually people just don't physically have time, or put it another way, there is too much work for them to do to actually have any amount of slack time to spend thinking about how they're going to improve stuff, how they're going to innovate, what new products. You could well have within your organization a number of people who could create the new Facebook. But if they don't have any time to actually spend working on it, they don't have any slack in the system. If the system itself doesn't have any slack, then you're never going to find out. And this is kind of related to the next point.
And I think Slack has this interesting thing about creating a space for people to think about things differently and give that opportunity for kind of happiness in a way. And has anyone read the book Drive by Dan Pink? If not, there's a really good summary. I think he's done a TED Talk, and there's a short YouTube clip that kind of summarizes a lot of it. One of the interesting things that he did was actually explore what makes people happy at work. And what's interesting is that the people that he explores, they also are very innovative in what they're doing. So they're very creative. And there's kind of three characteristics that make people kind of happy. One is about autonomy. So nobody likes being told what to do. So, having the ability to sort of decide what you do within a context makes people a little bit more fulfilled and a lot more creative. But if you're just left to your own devices and you kind of do stuff for yourself, that kind of gets a bit boring as well. So that's kind of balanced out by purpose. You kind of need a direction of which you're heading. You want to understand what you're doing. And what we've found with innovative companies is that people who are pretty independent but know that they're contributing to the bottom line or making their customers happy, that's a really strong drive to make people both successful, innovative, and very happy. And it's an interesting kind of balance. The other thing that's really interesting is this whole thing about mastery, is that in this book, Dan Pink explores people about, he interviews them and talks to them, and one of the things that makes people really happy is that they grow as a person. So, they have the freedom to do something, they're contributing to a good sort of direction, and they're kind of developing themselves as a human. And in this sort of quest for mastery, you're actually having to invent new ways of doing stuff. So, like, if you're sort of Twitter and you've been sort of doing this micro-blogging stuff, actually, if you want to do really well, you have to innovate because there's nobody else like you before. So in terms of driving out sort of through to mastery, you end up innovating because it's like one of those things that's a natural part of that course. Nobody has sort of trod down that path as well. It not only makes for happier people, but it generates a very innovative culture. So you can kind of think about these three elements in the work that you do. Another thing about this whole sort of innovation thing is, in terms of leadership, is what are those expectations? How much of stuff will succeed? How much of it will fail? As James alluded to, you have to be able to have a culture that is tolerant of failure, particularly when it comes to this. And what we've tended to observe is that there's a bit of an 80-20% rule. It's kind of Pareto's law. Is that actually most of the stuff that you try will fail. And it's really important to think about that it will. So it's about expectations management. It's about being fearless and being able to try stuff out without a fear of losing your job. And in the hope that you actually stumble across this kind of winning streak. But you really need to be able to support that. And what is really helpful is that you need to be able to fail fast. So you can't really wait 3 months, 6 months to fail. You want to be testing things out as quick as possible and then taking that feedback and changing direction. So hopefully you end up sort of succeeding at some point.
So I think we're pretty much coming to the end now. We've covered pretty much everything we wanted to cover. So I guess we'll summarize with some places you might want to go to get a bit more information about some of this. The first is there's an awful lot. It's very hipster to talk about lean startup at the moment. But there's some really good stuff in the lean startup movement. This is where the whole build, test.
And actually, there's a lot of communities that are around the lean startup movement here in the UK as well. And particularly around the digital roundabout, there's a lot of sort of meetups that it's really easy to go talk to people who are doing this stuff, who are trying out product ideas. And it's interesting to meet them because it feels like they're cut from a very different cloth from the organizations that we sometimes work with, in that they are very risk tolerant. You know, they want to try out these things, they have crazy ideas, and they're willing to fail. So thinking about how you get that culture, you have lots of places where you can sort of meet them. So I guess one of the things that we kind of want to close off with is that innovation is like one of those things that every company needs to do to survive. So Seth Godin, who's like this amazing marketer, has this quote from this book. There are only two choices: win by being more ordinary, more standard and cheaper, or win by being faster, more remarkable and more human. And this is where innovation is really important. Our key message for you is really just to have the courage to get started. You need the people, you need to give them the time, and you need to give them permission to be able to do this innovation. And particularly, I think a lot of you are sort of leaders in your organization, is that you guys have the ability to influence this stuff and make this stuff happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.